Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for choosing to be here today and for participating and engaging with us in our Arts and Activism panel. Thank you so much to Kirsty, Karen, and Peter for inviting me to be here today. I'm very honored and really looking forward to this panel. I'd also like to acknowledge that we are guests this afternoon on the Coast Salish People's Territory, so give a big chimigwech to them for having us here. My name is Lindsay Lachance. I am an Anishinaabe PhD student at UBC studying Indigenous performance. I'm really excited to be here, so let's get it started. I will introduce all of our panelists, and they will give their papers, and after that we'll open up the floor for discussion. So our first presenter is my colleague and friend, Selena Couture. She's a PhD candidate in theater studies at UBC. Her dissertation research focuses on Indigenous and settler performances near the Coast Salish village of Quaqui, or Brockton Point in Stanley Park. She has a particular interest in place, Indigenous languages, and historiographic methods. Selected publications include an article in Theater Journal on Sarah Siddons's performance in Sheridan's Pizarro, and an essay on the Kaloya Village tourist attraction in recasting commodity and spectacle in the Indigenous Americas. She has worked as an alternative school teacher. She's on the board of the Purple Thistle Center, a youth arts and activism resource center, and was a member of the editorial collective for Stay Solid, a radical handbook for youth published by AK Press. Today, Selena will share with us her paper entitled Performative Activism in Vancouver, from the Native Brotherhood to Mary Clemens's The Road Forward and Back. Originally from an arts background, we have Kirsten Forkert, who is a researcher and an activist. She is employed as a lecturer in the School of Media at Birmingham City University in Birmingham, UK. Her book, Artistic Lives, explores the material conditions faced by cultural producers in London and Berlin, focusing on the role of housing and welfare in relation to freelance cultural work. Kirsten is now working on another book entitled Austerity as Public Mood, as a part of Roman and Littlefield's Radical Cultural Studies series. The book discusses the cultural politics of austerity in the UK, and in particular the role of nostalgic conceptions of work and community to justify support of serious measures. She is also involved in Mapping Immigration Controversy, a collaborative ESRC-funded research project on UK government communications on immigration within a climate of increasing nationalism and right populism. Kirsten will share with us a paper she has titled Who Benefits? Gentrification, Evictions, and the Role of Culture in the 2012 London Olympic Games. Heather Sykes is an associate professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Her research interests focus on issues of sexuality, gender, and colonialism in physical education and sport, looking through the lenses of post-structural, queer, and feminist theories. Currently, she is researching how anti-colonial activists mobilize against sporting mega events such as the Olympics, and both the impossibilities and possibilities of alliances and solidarities with increasingly homo-national settler gay lesbian movements. Heather has been co-editor of the journal Curriculum Inquiry and is actively involved in the North American Society for Sport Sociology and the American Educational Research Association. Her paper is titled Olympics as a Theater of Roving Colonialism, Homo settler spectators on stolen land at the Vancouver Olympics. Last but not least, we have Priya Vadi, a PhD student at Royal Holloway University of London in the Department of Geography. Her broad research focuses on identity, culture, and consumption. Priya's current doctoral research explores public performances of diasporic Iranian identities in London and Vancouver through commercial food spaces in terms of production, consumption, and representation. Today she will share with us her paper, a reflection on Aboriginal participation in the 2010 Olympic Games planning process. So we'll start in that order, and we'll have 20 minutes, so you can look at me, and I'll keep you guys on time, hopefully.
Okay. Hi, can everyone hear me? And that looks okay? Okay. So before I start, I'd like to thank very much Karen, Peter, and Kirsty for inviting me to share my research, and also for employing me as an assistant. It's been really a pleasure to be here and listening to the thoughts and experiences of people who've been part of such a range of Olympic and related activities. I also want to thank Kelsey and Tara, my co-assistants. It's been a pleasure working with them. And I'm going to speak today about a specific performance in what this morning Janice called, in an interesting, thought-provoking way, another one of the protest zones, like part of the Cultural Olympiad, or actually it was at the performance I'm talking about was at the Aboriginal Pavilion, and examine ways that I think the performance modes have potential to intervene in time and space. So Indigenous performative activism as an intervention in large-scale spectacles and mega events has a long history in the unceded Coast Salish territories on which Vancouver is located. In referencing the performative for this work, I'm including Marie Clemence's The Road Forward, but also cultural dances performed for outsiders and political ceremony devised and enacted by the Native Brotherhood in 1946, the Native Brotherhood of BC. In this paper, I'll trace a small branch of genealogy of local and visiting Indigenous peoples' use of spectacle to stage activist interventions during and after mega events, with the intention of contextualizing contemporary methods of performative interventions. On the final day of the 2010 Olympics at the Aboriginal Pavilion, The Road Forward, a musical performance installation created and directed by Clemence, composed by Jennifer Kreisberg, and choreographed by Michael Greyeyes, was performed 6 times for the international audiences attending the event. The technical rehearsal for this performance was also filmed, and then Clemence developed this into an award-winning music video, which circulated to 16 film festivals, well, maybe more now, in North America and Europe, and continues to be available online. In February of 2013, at Vancouver's Push International Performing Arts Festival, Red Diva Projects, which is one of Clemence's production companies, and she works with Michelle St. John, then developed the full-length Aboriginal blues rock multimedia musical, which was performed for one night only at Club Push. So I was thinking about this paper could have, in some ways, also fit into the legacy discussions that was happening this morning in the way that Clemence has used the funding for the Olympics to continue developing this work. However, it also works the activist panel. A full analysis of all 3 iterations is beyond the scope of this paper, and while I'll be referring to the music video and showing you some clips, I will mainly discuss the most recent live performance at Club Push. Before I do, however, I would like to explain some of the performative work done by the Native Brotherhood of BC and who they are, in order to, because Clemence explicitly links her work in the program of her performance, as well as the images that she uses projected on stage. And I think it's important to understand who they were and what they did. So, the Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood of BC was founded in 1931 to promote higher standards of education, health, and living conditions for Indigenous people. It's the oldest active Native organization in Canada and continues to facilitate the implementation of management and development strategies that focus on capacity building. So post-World War II, the city of Vancouver planned a 2-week celebration of its 60th anniversary in 1946. And the Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood were involved. So I'm showing you now a black and white poster advertising the events. It's titled with a carnival-style script in large size at the top saying, "Celebrate with us, Vancouver's Diamond Jubilee." And it has an image of a man and a woman dressed in Victorian-era clothing, walking arm in arm with welcoming gestures. There are small, barely visible drawings of circles on the side that show renditions of events that are happening. And a listing of other events, including a giant 5-mile parade on July 1st and the Jubilee Show. So this show is described as running for 12 nights at the Timber Bowl, which was a specially built 15,000-seat stadium that they built in Stanley Park, and also has the involvement of various New York and American-based performers, as well as mentioning the 4,200 exclamation mark people involved in that show. A mega event of its own, I imagine. However, I'm not going to be discussing that at this point. Instead, I'm going to discuss this, which is up in smaller script on the bottom right-hand side of the poster, and it reads, "As an added attraction, be sure to see the Indian Village," which is in all caps, and underneath this is described as having tribal rituals, ... fire dances, ... the pulse-stirring Thunderbird dance, 2 exclamation marks, all caps, and many other wonders of Indian lore and customs that white men, capitalized, have not yet been privileged to see. So I'm going to describe this event, which I found mainly from documents in the city archives. However, I think is a very interesting part of that is that there was a very definite withholding of information. So I've got a big blue circle on the screen right now, which is for me representing the opacity that the Native Brotherhood worked with. So while the Indian Village and Show sounds as if it could have been a mess of cultural appropriation, as was the opening scene of that big Jubilee show, which was a red-faced potlatch ballet, and instead it seems to have been an opportunity that the Native Brotherhood used to further the agenda of recognition for Indigenous peoples' welfare and rights. The Diamond Jubilee Citizens Committee commissioned the show and asking for the Native Brotherhood's help in organizing it. The event happened at the site of Sanok, also known as Kitsilano Indian Reserve, or today's Vanier Park, which actually has been mentioned a number of times over the last few days. The Digital Natives project that Lorna Brown spoke about was happened at that site, and she also spoke about the historical mapping of the way that land has changed. So this is also part of the history of that site. Where was I? Okay, and was an example of cooperation between local Indigenous people and an organization that represented the Native population of BC. The program features an explanation of the Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood organizations with photos of the men of the executive of the Brotherhood in suits. It then has a welcome from the host, Chief Catalano, saying that the village has been set once again upon the soil where his grandfather stood, welcoming visiting chiefs, and where he played with his brothers and became a chief. He states in his remarks in the program, "This was our land, and now we share it with you. Feel secure, there is enough for all." So the statement is significant in that the land had been illegally taken from the Coast Salish people in 1913 when they were removed and their houses were burnt to the ground. The rest of the program includes essays, poetry, and descriptions of the installations, which were based on place name stories told to Pauline Johnson by Squamish leader Sapluk, who's also known as Chief Joe Capilano. 2 pages name the 40 dancers who perform nightly on a, quote, giant tom-tom, as well as the musicians and Dan Cranmer, who was the host of the 1921 Cranmer Potlatch. Some of you may have heard of that. It was a potlatch that was raided and is pretty significant in BC history. Was the announcer of the dances, which were also named in the program what they were. So the final event of the 2-week-long performance was a ceremony proclaiming the Governor-General of Canada, a war hero from World War II, Viscount Alexander, as an honorary chief. He was on his first tour of Canada at the time. According to the description in the program, Alexander presented himself and was greeted and escorted by 18 torchbearers, chosen braves of the tribe, who have served in World War II, and 25 chiefs in full regalia to a dais where the Native Brotherhood president, William Scow, performed the ceremony in native tongue, which was likely Kwakwala, which was then interpreted for the audience. So this black and white photo shows William Scow speaking into microphones while the Governor-General in military dress and likely a reporter listen very carefully. One person looks over Scow's shoulder as he reads and another is facing him. And because I'm very interested in languages, I can't really get into it now. I think it's really fascinating that you can see on this document that's a bilingual document with a rendition of Kwakwala at the top. So the Native Brotherhood carefully controlled the documentation of the Indian village and show. And Scow was quoted repeatedly in the media as the Citizen Committee had failed to provide adequately for the dancers, and there was a big controversy over this. The only photo documentation that exists of this whole event, the 2-week event, are photos from this final ceremony with the Governor General. There are various ways to consider the Indian village and show as performative activism. Performing the dances during this time of the potlatch ban was a chance to pass on cultural knowledge that may have been very difficult otherwise. The ceremony involving the Governor General and the Indigenous veterans, spoken in Kwakwala, was conducted at a time when Indigenous men were being denied veteran rights and when Indigenous languages were being suppressed in residential schools. So this all happened on the eve of the Special Joint Committee to Revise the Indian Act in 1946, in front of which Scow appeared about 6 months later. And which had part of the effect of that was to enfranchise Indigenous people. They had the vote in 1949, shortly after that Special Joint Committee. So while the Diamond Jubilee was not a mega event by our current standards, or what we've been discussing today, it did draw thousands of people, and the Native Brotherhood used their organizational structure to intervene in the celebration. Aaron Glass, in Objects of Exchange, Material Culture and Colonial Encounter, Indigenous Modernity, recognizes the opportunity that such encounters offered to Indigenous people. For the authorities, carefully circumscribed, aestheticized, and commodifiable production of the past was accepted as one minor step towards modernization. For First Nations, such a gap in colonial policy, however contradictory, may have created a space, however marginal, for social and cultural reproduction under new conditions of material flexibility and artistic freedom. So for the Native Brotherhood, the opportunity to transfer knowledge and represent Indigenous people to a larger public made it worth engaging in colonial attitudes, fetishizing Indian lore as pulse-stirring, in order to strengthen their political position. So now I'm going to move to 64 years later and show that Marie Clements put together that is inspired by the work of these people. So 64 years later, during the Winter Olympics, the form and context for performative activism was, of course, much different. So the archives of the Native Voice and the Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood were a major source of inspiration for Marie Clements, The Road Forward, which I'll now turn to. Okay. And hope that I'm not losing you by jumping all around in time and space. So I'm first going to describe and then show a short clip from the film that she made of the technical rehearsal of the performance that happened in the Aboriginal Pavilion, although I'll be discussing the performance at Club Push, which they're very, very similar. The Club Push one is expanded. So before, I'll just do a description of what I'm going to be showing in the video. The performance includes men in suits and women dressed in 1950s style costumes that evoke the Supremes, and combines a front-side on-stage view of them performing, which on a raised platform which has a large sculptural structure with 4 panels that the performers can step in and out of, and also a backside view that moves back and forth in the video of men and women in a darkened room sitting close to each other, or often looking close-ups of them looking gently at each other. It's also haunted by a glowing yellow orb that floats throughout the song, showing black and white archival images. At the end of this clip, these images are visible as they were projected on the dome of the Aboriginal Pavilion, and this is what the performers are singing and raising their hands to at the end in the gesture of thanks that Zaplik from Spakwa taught us on the first night we were here. So I'm going to show the film now. And hopefully it's all queued up.
There are no tears on the road, for there is no fear. You are inside me, brother, asking us to stay.
Okay, maybe I'll pause it, and hopefully it'll work for my later clip. There are multiple performance modes that are happening and that intervened in conceptions of time and on people's bodies in this music video as well as during the performance. So I'm going to now discuss this in terms of 3 different performance modes. And hopefully my video will work later. Okay. So the first one is the events in film representing the singers and musicians in a self-expressive, virtuosic performance mode. The singing compositions that integrate traditional and contemporary music, as displayed in the video by Michelle St. John at one point there, and also in this photo that I'm showing of the Push show that has 4 members of the band and 3 singers close up to the mics there. The performers had a very strong self-expressive presence. The ensemble sang mainly original songs with also 2 covers, one of which was LaBelle's 1975 disco hit, Lady Marmalade. The songs allowed the singers, St. John Kreisberg along with Sherry Maracle in the Push show, to soar and show off a range of vocal power that made me aware of their presence as supremely talented people. And as Peter Dickinson wrote in his blog, Performance, Place and Politics, they were a vocal soul of a galvanizing evening. The focus on the women's voices also underscores Clement's intention of honoring the women activists from the Native Sisterhood and memorializing missing and murdered Aboriginal women as well as connecting with powerful women from the Saskatoon who had spurred the Idle No More movement, and Chief Teresa Spence, whose 6-week hunger strike had only ended a week prior to this performance at Club Push. The strength of all these women's voices was represented in St. John Kreisberg's and Maracle's performances. The artistry of these women singers overtly commanded our attention, and the performers didn't fully disappear into their roles. And so while they were costumed to evoke a past era, some of the musical choices also supported this pastness, as did the projected materials, yet their self-expressive presence kept asserting the present. So next I'm going to move to an example of a collaborative mode. So during the Push Festival, projections expanded to include a live streaming of video and a Twitter feed. These elements allowed for a collaborative performance mode, or maybe we're just one part of the collaborative performance mode that was happening that night, asserting the contemporary connections to the heritage of the absent activists and ancestors. This constantly renewing present was also performed on the large frame-style hand drum, which was propped up in the front of the stage in the last photo I showed. The drum was used as a screen on and off throughout the show, and it had tweets rolling on it through the final half, such as the one that's depicted on the screen right now. In this photo, which is a tweet from Raven Go Electric Sol, which says, at Push Festival, hashtag the road forward, hashtag Idle No More, at Red Diva Projects, and then it says Soul Shakers. And includes a photo of the singers with the fuzzy 3D images of masks floating behind, which is another part of the show. With a combination of professional and amateur performers singing traditional and contemporary music, while 3D archival and contemporary images float behind them, the tweets were another assertion of live continuity. It's also significant as this is happening while hashtag Idle No More is all over the Twitter sphere. And the movement had been mentioned repeatedly throughout the evening, connecting the current activism with the historic work. The use of projected images also brings to mind Rebecca Schneider's assertions about the future that subsists in the still. Schneider suggests that the future subsists not only in the photo, but through the we, who look to rediscover it as still in the sense of the term that signifies remaining rather than silence and motionlessness. These layered moments of performance as the event concluded brought a collapse of the present and the historical to a crescendo. And now I'm going to move on to the representative mode. The performers were also working in a representational mode as historical personae to bring attention to local Indigenous histories. The costume design and the performance of the songs from the 70s were some methods of evoking people from the past. And one of the songs in particular composed for this event was also a strong evocation. It was sung by Os-12, Rondine Harris, and based on the words of a speech by George Manuel, a Shwepmo leader who was hugely influential in Canadian and international Indigenous organizing. This image on the screen right now depicts Os-12 singing in front of a microphone, holding a hand drum, and using it to point to the audience, while standing in front of a projection of a black and white photograph of Manuel wearing a headdress. Manuel was instrumental in the organizing against Trudeau's white paper, and internationally he was involved in the creation of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. He also coordinated support to ensure the protection of Aboriginal rights within the Canadian Constitution, and as a major organizer of the Constitution Express. OS12's song was called If You Really Believe. It was a hip-hop style iteration of a 1979 speech by Manuel, which repeatedly says, if you really believe that education for our children, or in different verses, our healthcare or housing, is our right, you don't ask for it, you take it. OS12's performance was riveting and aggressive and emotional. His skill as a self-expressive performer was on display, while at the same time he represented George Manuel's speech, thereby connecting our present with this past through affect. So I'm going to wind up now with, in 1946, going back to the first part of my presentation, the Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood worked within a limited opening, strategically provoking settler curiosity in dying, quotations, art forms, in order to engage a larger audience with the contemporary Indigenous issues. 64 years later, Clement's work with The Road Forward, started as a commissioned work for the Aboriginal Pavilion, has been able to reach an international audience, and Peter tells me today that it will be at Push this year as well, and in likely another iteration. This work, however, responds to the pressures. Her work responded to the pressures of a globalization to package a one-dimensional, historicized, or iconic Indigenous characters that the Olympics so much wanted to portray, by instead circulating uncontained and continuing identities presented through the use of modalities of performance that insist on effective connections and crossings of the past, present, and future. So, besides being an entertaining and inspiring evening that brought people together to collaborate, The Road Forward's reenactment of the Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood archives in the context of the Idle No More movement also demonstrates how this kind of crossing over, or in Rebecca Schneider's formulation, a chiasmatic movement, as represented through the Greek letter chi on the screen right now, can be part of a revolution. In this time of resurging activity and strength, a connection with the power of those who've passed, not merely by understanding the facts of their activities, but by summoning their presence, contributes to a forward momentum or a temporal reach. To complete my discussion of this work today, I'd like to now return to the song, The Road Forward, and quote a few lines. I feel you beside me, I know your name. I hear your voice becoming ours, it is the same. I feel your breath, I know your pain, I hear you cry. We carry the load together, you and I. The words themselves are a powerful way of connecting with people who made up the Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood. And if it works, as music has the power to detach from an event, leaving with the audience to resound in their memories, I hope to conclude now with the voices of the performers. So let's see if it works. Darn, it didn't work. I'll have to play it for you later. Make it work? Anyway, so that's it for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So move on to Kristen. Thanks.
Okay, so I should say that excuse me, I'm based in cultural studies, but I'm originally from an art background, and I am not a specialist on mega events. So I just want to, as a bit of a preamble, what I'll be doing is I'll be drawing on some of the observations from the last book that I wrote called Artistic Lives, which basically it was looking at the material conditions of artists and was based on a comparison of London and Berlin, and which at the time, sort of in the European context, represented these two extremes in terms of particularly housing and the cost of living. And because of when I was doing the interviews, the book wasn't about the Olympics, but it ended up being mentioned, I think, in one of the interviews in particular, which I'll be drawing on, and as well as more generally some of the observations from the book. So what I'll be doing is I'll be starting with a critique of policy discourses which frame culture within the framework of economic development, and then I'll be turning to a discussion of the Olympics and the intensification of gentrification processes, then how this in turn affected cultural producers in London. And lastly, I will talk about some of the activism that took place in London in response to the Olympics, some of which I participated in. That's another hat where I'm also an activist. And so I'll be, and basically I'll be arguing, I'll be sort of bring these elements together, but I'll be arguing that mega events such as the Olympics intensify particular contradictions and inequalities within the urban context, which will have consequences for both local residents and for cultural producers. So I'll just get this going. And I don't need to see the second one yet. Right. Okay, so first to audio describe the slide. This is a photograph I took of the hoarding around the Olympic site, and it has the word create on it on the left-hand side. Then there are a bunch of corporate logos, including Coca-Cola, on the right-hand side, which to me raises questions about creativity being framed within kind of corporate and promotional terms. This isn't about creativity as subversion. So I'll talk first about some of the contradictions around culture as economic development. So one of the contradictions that I was trying to explore in the book is around the role of culture in relation to economic development, and particularly the creative industries-driven policies inspired by authors such as Richard Florida and Charles Landry and others, which still remain influential within cultural and urban policy circles, which frame the value of culture primarily in its ability to boost economic growth, rather than seeing culture as valuable in itself or perceiving it as a public good. According to Nick Garnham, such ideas have traction for largely pragmatic reasons, such as the understanding that arts for art's sake arguments will no longer fly with politicians who increasingly seek everything according to a market logic. Indeed, mega events are often marketed in similar terms as boosting local economies and therefore benefiting local communities. But how does culture as economic development work in practice? What often results is gentrification, as rents and property prices increase with consequences for local residents, as well as for independent cultural producers and organizations. As cultural economy researcher Andy Pratt says about the London neighborhood of Hoxton, in an article he wrote studying how is the target of one of these schemes, he says, out of the ashes arises residential development with precious little redistribution or spread effect and little space or opportunity for cultural producers. And geographer Stefan Kratka has also argued that policies positioning culture in the heart of economic development can actually make the situation more difficult for cultural producers, particularly smaller independent ones who cannot compete with large corporations or large institutions. But despite these sorts of critiques, the belief in culture as economic development largely goes unquestioned. For example, a 2011 Greater London Authority report acknowledged that these sorts of policies accelerate gentrification processes in which low-income residents are displaced by wealthier residents with greater purchasing power. However, the report also questions whether this is actually a bad thing, and actually lists rising property prices as an indicator of success, which suggests they actually think it's a good thing. And if the fact that people get displaced, then oh well. The second related contradiction I was trying to explore is a tendency to think about artists and other cultural producers as though their interests and needs are fundamentally separate from those of other local residents. So, and this is because we tend to assume cultural producers are resourceful and are really good at creating something from nothing. And in part this is because of some long-standing popular perceptions about the bohemian lifestyle, but also the reality of having to actually create a lot of things from nothing, as we all know. There's also, as well, one thing I've noticed, particularly in the news media lately, is a very persistent stereotype that everyone who works in culture, particularly high culture, comes from a privileged background, and thus has no need for affordable housing or decent wages or a social safety net like everybody else. And I would say that both perceptions are about distancing the situation of cultural producers from ordinary people and about disavowing material conditions. So with that in mind, what sorts of material conditions exist in London? Through the process of doing the interviews, I heard many stories from London artists about rent increases and being evicted from studios and from living spaces, and as well as people only being able to afford to live in the peripheral areas of the city, so having to commute for quite long distances. And because of these sorts of conditions, time and space was pressurized. So I also heard stories about people renting studios but who would have no time to spend in them because they were working at day jobs all day to pay very expensive rent. Or people who are being evicted from their homes and studios quite frequently. And I would say I did these interviews between 2008 2010, and this was actually before the coalition government came to power and started imposing austerity measures. But I would say, or the Olympics, even though, as I said, this did get mentioned a couple of times in the interviews, but these tendencies, I think, have only intensified since this point, particularly in terms of the financialization of housing in London. And I'll give you some examples. And so the slide I'll be showing you are some statistics about housing in London at the present moment. So just to give you a sense of what things are like right now. So now housing prices are 20% higher than 2007, the last time there was a property bubble. There was a study that was done on Gumtree, which is quite similar to Craigslist, that showed that the average rent in London is £1,516 or $789, as opposed to £665 or $1,223 in the rest of the country. And there are now schemes, there's one called auction lets, where tenants actually bid against each other to rent a property. And squatting of residential properties has become a criminal offense. And various politicians have called to make squatting of commercial properties also a criminal offense as well. So what does this actually have to do with mega events? And what I'm arguing is that mega events can play a role in exacerbating property speculation and inequality, intensifying what Loretta Lees calls super gentrification. And super gentrification is when you have the big developers that move in and build the big tower blocks, and there isn't a kind of intermediate phase where you have sort of restaurants and wine bars and that sort of thing. Or what Paul Watts calls state-led gentrification, gentrification that is a result not only of the property market but also of government policy. And so I would say that what we're seeing with we've been seeing with kind of Brazil's World Cup, with what is happening with the favelas, or the preparations for the World Cup in Qatar are I think only a more extreme example of how mega events affect cities and what Jules Boykoff calls celebration capitalism, disaster capitalism's affable cousin. So I'm going to show you some statistics about evictions in London. There's sort of a slightly faded out image behind it, which is of it's sort of a building site again behind the hoarding. So the Clays Lane housing estate, which was like a social housing complex, was destroyed to build the Olympic site, and it was home to 450 tenants who were all evicted. And one of the residents was interviewed in the Guardian, and he said that there were some quite vulnerable people who had kind of lost all their local kind of support networks as a result. The Carpenters housing estate, which housed 700 tenants, from what I understand, is now boarded up. And as well, in addition to social housing, there are a lot of private landlords who ended up evicting people illegally so they could charge inflated Olympic rents, which in some cases, according to BBC News, were 20 times the original rent that people were paying. So this sort of residential displacement is an example of what Andrew Smith calls the dark side of events. And according to sociologist Ann Power, the Olympics also had a dramatic effect on residential housing prices in East London. But then, didn't the Olympics benefit the local economy, as was promised? I mean, ironically, there actually were more international tourists in 2011 than there were in 2012. A lot of sort of shops and actually some West End theatres had to sort of suspend performances and that sort of thing. And Ann Powers also argued that the economic benefits to the immediate area were quite limited and did not really help the many low-income residents. And we've heard already about the athletes' village, now become the East Village, yesterday. So I guess you can pretend you're in Manhattan, which is typical of the fantasy sold by loft condos. You can be in this sort of cosmopolitan, sophisticated anywhere. But also the affordable housing, and the term affordable in housing lingo actually means 80% of private rent. So market rent rate, I meant, was significantly more expensive than the social housing that it actually replaced. And as well, 200 local businesses were evicted to build the Olympic site. So I would argue that this sort of situation of this kind of gentrification and this sort of displacement, I would say that I think it places cultural producers in a very difficult and contradictory situation, and cuts to arts funding often leave people with no choice but to pursue cultural funding connected to mega events. And I would argue this is symptomatic of a larger trend whereby funding public service infrastructure can only be justified when connected to mega events, including, as I've heard, the train that I've taken to this part of the city here. And also we've seen many examples, many powerful examples through the conference of how artists have successfully used Olympic commissions to stage progressive politics and to create critical and challenging work. But the question I'm trying to ask about is really about the underlying structural issues. And I'm really trying to ask how cultural producers might be affected by mega events in similar ways to local residents, as in the acceleration and intensification of property speculation, leading to higher rents for living, studio, and presentation spaces. Neville mentioned the Yardley perfume factory, and there were apparently 500 studios in that building, and that is now gone. And apparently there's now other studio space being built elsewhere, but it's not the same amount of studios. So that's so it wasn't just living spaces that were evicted, and also Liza Fiore talked about how many artists in Hackney Wick and Fish Island were also threatened with displacement, or they were put on kind of short leases or higher rent because landlords were kind of keeping one eye on forthcoming development plans. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to draw on one of the interviews from the book. And so one of the artists I interviewed told me about a shared studio space and project space in Hackney Wick, which was close to the Olympic site, being evicted due to the Olympics. And he told me about how the Olympics had increased the property value of the area, which in his case produced a rent gap situation where the land below the building became worth more than the building itself that he was in. And he said that immediately after the success of the Olympic bid was announced, the landlord, as he put it, saw dollar signs, an Americanism, but basically said he wanted to demolish the building. And then the artist asked his MP for help and said, "Can you please intervene?" But then she said she couldn't really do anything, and even though she was quite sympathetic and didn't want to see this studio and gallery space disappear, but there was also kind of a sense that politicians couldn't be seen as anti-development or anti-landlord. So, this is only really one example, but I think it raises questions about the devaluation of cultural activities which are not connected to mega events. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to very briefly talk about resistance. And I think we've already heard about Laura Oldfield Ford and Savage Messiah and Ian Sinclair's work, so I'm not going to repeat that, but I will talk about other examples of resistance. The Games Monitor Group extensively documents and researches the effects of the Olympics and actually involves some of the displaced local residents from the Clays Lane housing estate. As well, collectives such as This Is Not a Gateway and We Sell Boxes and We Buy Gold, which is a curatorial project. They've also organized various events and sort of public debates raising questions about the Olympics. And as well, the architect Ana Mendes de Andes organized a really interesting kind of bus and boat tour called I Love 2.3 billion, 2.3 billion pounds being the original budget for the Olympics, which has now been exceeded, and quite drastically in collaboration with Games Monitor. And so I'll just, and this is the tour bus that the photo we're looking at is the tour bus that that was driven around the Olympic site. As we were given a kind of guided tour about the sort of effects on the local neighborhood. So there were these sorts of activities. As well, the Counter Olympics Network staged a protest around the time of the Games. I was at this as well. And I should also point out that one of the banners you can see there is from Disabled People Against the Cuts, and they were also involved in protesting the Olympics, and particularly because the Paralympics was sponsored by this company Atos, who I don't have time to really go into this detail, but they've basically outsourced some of the government sort of services, and it's to do with tests for disabled people on benefits. And they've been basically making life miserable, like declaring people who are cancer victims or people who are, I think one person who was in a coma as being fit for work and thus in threat of losing. So it's sort of, the idea that they're actually sponsoring the Paralympics has some very complicated politics associated with it. at the time, some of the numbers were reduced because there were actually a lot of preemptive arrests. They arrested a whole bunch of people on a critical mass bike ride. And as well, they also targeted some well-known activists and preemptively arrested them. And including actually a friend of mine who is now pursuing a legal challenge to, I think it's now at the European Court of Human Rights. So there was a real kind of clampdown on protests that happened at the time. But I think also it's a kind of very difficult thing to protest the Olympics, and because it is a kind of a feel-good media ritual, and it also, I mean, it does enjoy a lot of public support, and I think we heard about the affective dimensions of the Olympics this morning, but also, I mean, how can you argue against something that athletes have spent their lives training for? How can you argue against something like this? It is very difficult, but I would also argue that there are possibly processes of silencing and kind of self-censoring that maybe take place where, if you're not enthusiastic about it, then what's wrong with you? So I do kind of wonder about that. So returning to the interview with the artist who lost the studio space, I asked him if he was concerned about the gentrification of the East London resulting from the Olympics, and he kind of was quite angry, and he said he felt that it represented a lack of respect for the history of that area, and the cultural community that he felt had developed on very little public support, and he felt it was just sort of being wiped away and seen not to matter. But I asked him if he felt there was anything he could do, and then he said that the best strategy was actually to avoid attention. And then, the actual phrase was, "Maybe we'll creep around the edges and we'll be fine," which I thought was quite revealing. And the slide I'm showing now is another photo I took of the hoarding, and he used the phrase "creeping around the edges." I almost imagining creeping around the edges of that hoarding. But this is kind of about camouflage and subterfuge. It's about avoiding attention. It's not really about collective action. And I would argue that this is about some very persistent and traditional ideas about what it means to be an artist, and maybe there's not really space for people in local politics, but I also would argue that it's symptomatic of a political climate, and we've become very used to the idea that the only way to respond is through individualized adaptation. But the other issue is that some people felt they had no right to be involved in housing activism, and I would say this is partly due to the very problematic nature of some anti-gentrification campaigns, which mobilize discourses around authenticity and focus sort of on long-term residents only. And so artists, by nature, within this kind of very narrow framework, become seen as inauthentic. You're the gentrifiers, and so some people. The artists I spoke to who are in gentrifying neighborhoods they felt they had no right or no place to be involved in anti-gentrification campaigns. And so I was really wondering who was making them feel unwelcome, actually. And I would argue that this emphasis on kind of preserving local authenticity actually limits the reach and appeal of these campaigns and the involvement of some really creative, imaginative people, actually. And I would say that, to conclude, I would say that what we need are more imaginative and more sort of inclusive approaches in response to gentrification and the accelerated pressures resulting from mega events. And we need campaigns which do not pit long-term residents against more recent ones within a framework of authenticity. And we also need campaigns which can create solidarities between cultural producers and housing activists. And I'm hoping this is kind of one of the things we can discuss in the question period in terms of a kind of transnational and sharing of experience and ideas as well as tactics and strategies for resistance. So that's it.
So I have many affective ties, and really my work is about how Is it on? Yeah. So Stephen Harper said, go watch the Olympics, because he was getting too much heat about the neo-colonial military war he was putting Canadian troops into. So militarism and sport and the Olympics have always been connected. And so, but people aren't paying attention to that. They want to watch the Olympics. Nobody's talking about Afghanistan. Then we have G8, G20 in Toronto. There's lockdown, there's security. A lot of the white and mainstream Canadian public are quite outraged about that. And then also I'm in queer studies, and in the Toronto Gay Pride March in 2010, there was a threat to withdraw funding from Gay Pride because it was getting too political. Pro-Palestinian activists in a group called Queers Against Israeli Apartheid, wanted to march in solidarity with the Palestinians, but the city was threatening that was anti-Semitic, so here's how the Zionism works, even within the gay movement. So those three events, Harper's Watch the Olympics, Gay Pride, Don't Be Political, and then predictable outrage about an economic summit, all of which are securitized, really worried me. Gay Pride, it was a discussion about politics. The economic summit was a discussion about securitization and economics. I mean, those are legitimate things where there should be dissent. But with the Olympics, where was the dissent? There was none. So then I thought, I've got to understand, how do we get critical voices around sport to be mobilized? Are the activists that are working within, say, the gay movement and in activism around economic summits, how are they mobilizing with before and after the Vancouver Olympics? The other part of how I came into this project is looking at how do we teach this in schools. So I looked at the Ontario curriculum. We have curriculum standards and expectations. Grade 11, physical education, is about leadership. And so they give you examples of what that could be. And one of the examples that you could do is to host a mini Olympics. Right alongside that, there's a citizenship curriculum in our high schools in Canada, which is about different forms of citizenship. So coming from a queer politic, not a lesbian and gay politic, I saw I can apply for a federal grant to work on citizenship, the inclusion of marginalized voices, because it seemed to me that activists have the knowledge about sovereignty and citizenship that we need in the schools. So I got the grant. And that's the kind of where I come from for this project. Looking at Vancouver initially, I wanted to find out who was involved and what form of solidarities there were with the protests No Olympics on Stolen Land. So I wanted to know how the lesbian and gay kind of groups were involved in that. And I searched really hard. Didn't find anything. But I came up with the pride houses. So the slide here is the logo, one of the logos for No Olympics on Stolen Land. It has that text, and then it has indigenous graphic about the mountains, and I'm not sure whether they would be wolf. Could anybody help me? Two animals pulling the Olympic rings apart. One of many graphics. So trying to find out how gay and lesbian movements were involved in that. The press coverage and came up with that the Vancouver Olympics was the first time ever in Olympic history, because Canada's so inclusive, so multicultural, and so not homophobic, transphobic. It has no gendered violence. It has no colonial gendered violence. that we can have a pride house. And so the link here is, there's no colonial gendered violence and no homophobia. There's a tension there. What sort of gendered violence? How deep does the gendered violence go for, and I keep saying, the gay and lesbian movement, quite deliberately. So the short history of the pride houses, a safe space for the lesbian and gay communities to spectate and get some support houses. There were 3 set up. The first was set up on Whistler Mountain. It was advertised as part of this inclusion initiative, but actually it was purely commercial. 2 white gay businessmen set this up, invested $100,000 of their own money because they have an annual gay ski week, but that was the exact same week as the Olympics was coming in, so they had to do something else in that week. It got momentum, and then they realized they could kind of expand that, so they went to a bar on Davis Street and made that kind of a celebration, drink and watch the game space, and then also in the LGBT Community Centre in Vancouver was where the support services were provided. The most political that the Pride houses got was supporting asylum refugee claims. Here we have the imperial imaginary of the lesbian and gay movement that there's going to be a flood of people coming from homophobic nations over there who will want to seek asylum in the Olympics. So I've written about that in more detail. But the people that come to the Olympics are part of the Olympic family. There were no asylum claims made from people coming for the Olympics. There were 6 expressions of interest, but from people that were already in Canada. So then I was like, well, how to think about this? It's not about a blunt critique of what these particular organizers of the Pride House were doing. So I'm going to step back and if you can, I know it's the middle of the afternoon, but 2 big concepts. To get at the logics that are underneath all this. It's not about those particular people all the time. Some of it is. So one concept that really has been circulating is about the notion of the Olympics as neoliberal, as a global force and as a brand. That doesn't get at really what it does for me. It goes in and it takes land, it steals land, it privatizes land, and it evicts and it kills people as a system. It's a colonial system. And it always has been. It started as an imperial colonial project in France and Europe, and it's become more disguised. It still pops around every 2 years, every 4 years, so it roves, and it's temporary. So the one concept that I'm trying to bring out, as well as neoliberalism, globalization, it's a form of roving colonization. That's what these mega events, the sports events, do. Are you with me? What concept number 1? All right. There's only one other big concept, and that is homo nationalism. Okay, the homo part. Work with me here. Not the hetero, right? So it's nationalism, but it's homo nationalism. So when I say gay and lesbian movements, it's a particular form of gay and lesbian movement that is getting really aligned with what the nation wants or what neoliberalism wants. It has this convivial, easy relationship. So those are the 2 concepts that when I trying to look at reimagine where LGBT, queer, two-spirit, and other politics of sexuality, what direction are they going in? So the Pride houses, really the analysis there was they had no connection. There was no connection with the no Olympics on stolen land. So these are settler queers in this moment wanting into the Olympics and oblivious about the land that the Pride houses is on. So there's a lot more detail to that about land ownership as opposed to stewardship, But basically, that's how I read what the dominant kind of gay and lesbian politics were in Vancouver. How am I doing for time?
Good. You're at 10 minutes.
10? Okay. So the indigenous people, especially on the west coast, but everywhere there's a winter tourism industry, have been resisting well before the Olympics. So all up the west coast in the ski resorts here, indigenous people have been holding camps, have been resisting in court, because the notion of coming in and developing a ski resort requires the land to be bought and sold. It requires it to be managed and then hyper-commercialized. So that has been happening for, as far as I know, at least 25 years on ski resorts up the west coast. And this, not just the homo-nationalism, but the whole colonial mentality of winter sports is very deep. I mean, you can't have a Winter Olympics without owning a mountain and building on it. So here, the nexus of corporate, the corporate and the settler colonial, ex-Olympian Nancy Green, she's an icon, she's a Canadian senator, she's also a CEO of the company that keeps developing more and more ski resorts. Skiing's pretty fun, right? So to question this takes away a lot of pleasure. But what I'm trying to kind of, how can queer politics think about its own logic and start to decolonize that? And it goes in sport to the very heart of we might have to risk taking away our fun for a little while. So on the screen I showed two logos of campaign graphics, black and white, from the one on the screen that at the moment has a skier. It's like a road sign with a no entry kind of slash through it diagonally. It's actually an arrow, and on the body of the head of the skier has a $sign, and the body of the skier has NGR Inc., which is Nancy Green Rain Incorporated. So there's a picture there of three able-bodied, white-looking gay men on a ski lift chair with ski goggles on. We don't know if they have skis on because we can't see their legs. And they're just wearing underwear. So it's this white gay male homoerotic ski promo ad thing. A lot of washboard stomachs. So there's a lot of, fat phobia and body fascism in there, which is another issue to look at. But they're going up to have a nice time. So this is kind of the imagery of gay winter tourism. That comes from one of the brochure or the online adverts for Winter Pride. So the Whistler Ski Week. So I hope that I've kind of raised the tension between the question there is about what sort of settler colonial and imperial logics were at work within the lesbian and gay movement as it wanted to be involved in the Olympics. So in Sochi, every site that these mega events touch down, the history of colonization is different. The history of nationalism is different. The history of neoliberalism is not so different. But of course, it's going to be site-specific. So in Sochi, what was the protest that perhaps most of you might have heard about in relation to the Sochi Olympics? Pussy Riot? Pussy Riot, yep. And? Yeah, Putin's anti-gay laws, which are connected. So Pussy Riot is protesting the repression of dissent, especially by this move to kind of a Russian Christian orthodoxy within Putin's regime, and then also anti-gay laws. So 2 years before the Olympics, the Putin regime quickly brought in some very reactionary, very homophobic laws. criminalizing same-sex adoption. It was legal, and now it was suddenly criminal, so you could have adopted a child, and all of a sudden that was a criminal act. Talking about homosexuality, like no promo homo in London 15, 20 years ago, you couldn't promote homosexuality. That was criminalized by the law, and sexual acts were criminalized by death, although it's really hard to catch people in the act. So that's always a kind of a stupid way to go about criminalizing. But that move by Putin 2 years before the Olympics garnered a lot of international, mostly Western outrage, not just by lesbian and gay groups, but by the West. So then it came in to like a clash of civilizations, not Islamic Christian, East-West, but Putin's kind of political intent is that there's a traditional Christian orthodoxy in Russia versus the kind of civilization of Christianity in the West. So it's kind of a traditional modernity in domestic politics that this tapped into. There were calls for boycotts, there were calls for athletes to come out or protest within the games. Helen Lenski has documented that in her book, Over the Rainbow, Beyond the Rainbow. And it's an important protest, of course. That's a really important protest. But still, that was 2 years before the Olympics. That caught the global imagination of activists. The slide I have up here shows 2 pictures of Putin, the head of him on a graphic with a gay rainbow behind his head. He has lipstick on, somehow perhaps that pulls him into queerness. And then there's the Olympic rings with barbed wire above one of the posters, and a call for boycott on the other. So the image now to move to is a black and white image. The top right-hand corner has a white triangle, and on the dividing line between the black and the white, there is a black image of a skier. So the dividing diagonal line represents a mountain. And most of the poster is black. That's in the top corner. Just beneath the skier are 5 skulls arranged in the organization of the 5 Olympic rings, 5 human skulls. And then as you go down right to the bottom of the slide, there's another skull. It's rather faded. There are remains, perhaps bones. It's not quite clear. The text on that says, "You will be skiing on mass graves in Sochi." So this image comes from a campaign that started as soon as Sochi was awarded the bid. Sochi is the indigenous homeland of the Circassian people, who are majority Muslim people. 150 years ago, on the anniversary, 2014, there was a genocide in Sochi. 1.5 million Circassians who had been involved in a colonial war, Russian Circassian war, were either forced into deportation across the Black Sea to Turkey, and then their diaspora is through Syria, Jordan, Israel, some in Canada, some in New York. The Circassians in Syria, part of their issue is that they want to go back to Circassia because of the neo-colonial war in Syria, and there's no right of return. Russia will not allow them to go back. So Circassians activists organized to do 3 things. One was to try to get Russia, now that it had won the bid, to change the host city, hold it somewhere else, just not in Sochi, recognize that there was a genocide, and grant the right of return. So I'll show a few more images from this, and as I do, bear in mind that the big protest that got picked up by the West was the anti-gay laws. This protest had been going for 7 years prior, about Muslim bodies, 1.5 million, a genocide. So here again, it's like what has been imagined within global international gay politics. This image shows a ski jumper in the air, jumping, flying over a set of headstones. And the headstones have the May the 21st, which is 1864, which is the anniversary date of the end of the massacre. The campaign was based out of Istanbul. They called for people to put their images in. This image is the winning image. It's a white background with a red mountain. It has a black graphic of a skier. It's not a red mountain, it's a red triangle. And again, the skier is sliding down the slanty side of the red triangle, and behind the skis is spurting out snow. But the snow and the mountain are colored red. So in my interviews with activists, Circassian activists, sometimes the mountain in Sochi is translated as Red Hill. In Russian, it's Krasnaya Polyana. But he translates it as this mountain is called the Pot of Blood. So it's about the amount of blood that was spilled in the massacre. So these images are trying to educate. Initially, the campaign was called No Sochi, like N-O, don't have it. 2 months before the Games, they realized they weren't going to relocate it. And so they changed the campaign to a different spelling. It's still No Sochi, but the no is K-N-O-W, meaning to know, come to know about Sochi. So that was the move that they made, and this is a kit that they tried to distribute to athletes. So there's a final image about a kind of a web banner, Sochi 2014, over our dead bodies. It has a hockey player, the legs of a hockey player and a hockey stick coming to make a big slap shot. Where the puck should be, there's a human skull, and again across the ice, instead of ice flying up, there's a red graphic of blood. My question is, what do we need to do in the LGBT movement globally, internationally, in the West, to bring together activism about the anti-gay laws and to work against the amnesia about colonial genocides, this one against Circassian Muslims? Very quickly, in Rio de Janeiro, the story that I could get involved in was right by the soccer stadium, the big one in Rio. It's called Maracanã. There is an important building called the Maracanã Village, where indigenous people hold their ceremonies. It's a living museum. It was the planned site of the first indigenous university. It was an occupation. The building is still standing, but the indigenous people, urban indigenous people in Rio, were evicted for the Olympics. 3 images show literally this building is across 100 meters away from the soccer stadium. The soccer stadium's been endlessly renovated. And there are evictions happening in the favelas of historically black communities, alongside the eviction of the indigenous people from the Maracanã village. This image shows a painting of an indigenous person with red, black ceremonial makeup paint on the wall of the village, but the barricades that have been put up covers the bottom half of the face, and so that was 4 weeks before the FIFA World Cup. So to wrap up, in Rio, one of the indigenous people that was involved in that occupation of their occupying their land in the indigenous village, I said, so is there any kind of solidarity with the queer politics? He said, yeah, we've had a lot of queers in here. A lot of the indigenous people are queer, although we use a different name for that. But these were queers who had no housing. They were queers, anarchists, and punks who were in the other squats in Rio. When they lost those, they came into the indigenous village. So that type of politics, which actually played out in Amsterdam around the Gay Games, are moments of solidarity with a very different underlying kind of range of possibilities that is different from perhaps having a pride house. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
So the title that I want to speak to today is a reflection on Aboriginal participation in the 2010 Olympic Games planning process. This presentation comes out of my master's research on how Aboriginal people in Vancouver and the surrounds were engaged in the 2010 Olympic Games planning process, considering the specific claims of Canada's Aboriginal population to the right to participate in public processes. In addition, this study considers the questions of commodification and appropriation of culture and the extent to which Aboriginal participation in the 2010 Aboriginal participation in the 2010 Olympic Games was a spectacle. More specifically, the two central aims were to examine how Aboriginal participation has evolved in the Olympic Games and what this has meant for various stakeholders involved. And secondly, to analyse the quality of Aboriginal participation and the extent to which it was effective in the case of Vancouver 2010. Rather than repeat, I hope to complement Janice's talk from this morning. Practically, I will start by saying a little on Aboriginal participation in the 2010 Olympic Games planning process. Then I will elaborate on the cultural involvement in the Games, cultural resistance to the Games, and conclude by looking at the legacies of Aboriginal participation. Since the 1994 Lilyhammer Games, there have been expectations of sustainable development and sustainability to be incorporated into the Olympic Games planning process. This later progressed and led the IOC to adopt an Agenda 21 in 1999, which expanded the wider sustainability umbrella, not just to solely focus on the environment, but to also include the social aspects of the Games. This means that local and national Olympic organising committees should be looking to improve social conditions and strengthen the roles of major groups such as Indigenous peoples in the Games. In the case of Vancouver, VANOC formed collaborative and reciprocal relationships with local and national First Nation, Inuit and Métis groups, and prided itself in being the first Olympic organising committee forming an official partnership with a local First Nation on whose traditional territories the Games were held, as is shown on the map in this slide. These nations included the Lilwat in the red, Squamish in the green, Musqueam in the yellow, and Tsleil-Waututh nations in the blue. Representatives of those four nations formed the Four House First Nations Society, which was a non-profit organisation. This organisation worked with VANOC to coordinate Olympic events and activities. With the help of the Four House First Nations, VANOC aimed to achieve unprecedented Aboriginal participation through a variety of programs. According to VANOC's official website, these facets included partnership and collaboration, sport and youth, economic development, cultural involvement, and awareness and education. British Columbia is the subject of a great debate over Aboriginal rights and title. The province rests mostly on unsettled Aboriginal territories, left out of historic treaty negotiations between the First Nations and government officials. Given British Columbia's political and legal context, it was in VANOC's best interest to involve the Four House First Nations in the participation process. In fact, the success of Vancouver's bid for the Olympics rested largely on the ability of VANOC and the province to demonstrate a positive and working relationship with the local First Nations groups. The Four House First Nation VANOC partnership was viewed as being both groundbreaking in extending power and benefits to the local First Nations and was a legal necessity to accommodate Aboriginal rights and title. Although the Four House First Nation VANOC partnership recognised the need to address Aboriginal rights and title, in the context of the Sydney Games, Richard Cashman argues, quote, "It is extravagant to believe that an international sporting event could act as a change agent in any substantive way for such entrenched problems," end quote. My findings showed that there were conflicting views about the partnership. The Four House First Nations saw it as a way to shed the stereotyped image of Aboriginal people and social beliefs, whereas opponents saw the partnership as a facade, masking issues such as native poverty and would do nothing to advance Aboriginal rights and title. Indigenous scholar Darren Godwell argues that Olympic Place promoters appropriate many elements of local and national culture to promote and distinguish their games from others. He states, quote, "Every conceivable distinguishable feature is seized upon, repackaged, and subsequently relaunched as unique quality peculiar to those particular games. Geography is co-opted, architecture symbolized, national values reframed to reinforce Olympic ideals, national politics suspended to fabricate non-partisan support, cultures essentialized to serve every occasion," end quote. Numerous times, Vanok reiterated the importance of the four host First Nations and undertook extensive measures to make the four host First Nations partners. The initiatives taken by Vanok and its affiliates were reflective of this. Aboriginal involvement in the Games was particularly focused on the cultural involvement and the material cultural landscapes of Vancouver, reframed and reworked, reflecting a sense of place and harmonious social relationships. Perhaps an obvious place to start is at Vancouver International Airport, which becomes both an aviation port and a gallery or installation in the metaphorical sense, highlighting how there can also be a tendency for commercial spaces to recreate identity in a creative and sometimes idiosyncratic ways, fashioned by less predictable passions from both producers and consumers, thus becoming, as argued by Peter Adey, a themed space. Its website states, "Vancouver International Airport offers a spectacular visual display of award-winning art and architecture, offering visitors a unique journey of land, sea, and sky. Each terminal building strategically represents the cultural heritage, natural beauty, and iconic experiences that embody British Columbia," end quote. During the renovation process in preparation for the Games, the domestic terminal was aesthetically designed, portraying the physical and cultural character of the landscape of the sea-to-sky highway that connects Vancouver to Whistler. YVR has an extensive collection of Aboriginal art and rotating pieces, including its centerpiece sculpture, The Spirit of the Haida Gwaii, The Jade Canoe, by late Haida artist Phil Reed. The images in the slide show two pieces created by native artist Steve Smith, centered on the theme of travel, which were installed in 2009 in the domestic terminal. The image on the left is the Freedom to Move. It consists of 6 large double-sided red cedar panels mounted within a water feature. On one side, the panels represent a killer whale, grizzly bear, and eagle. On the other, the eagle is replaced with the image of a raven with its wings spread open. The installation on the right is the Sea to Sky, consisting of 12 double-sided ceremonial drums suspended above one of the main gate areas. Referencing the YVR theme of sea, land, and sky, the drums are painted with images of animals from these 3 realms. For the 2010 Winter Olympic Games, Vanok officials effectively branded the city of Vancouver using Aboriginal imagery. This place promotion strategy was reflected in the choice of the official logo, a stylized inukshuk, which is traditionally the symbol of the Inuit, as well as the design of the mascots, which were based on local Coast Salish mythology. According to Jeff Rule, Vanok relied on the inukshuk as a national symbol, reflecting the values of Canadian society and reinforcing the mottos of Vanok and Conservative government, with glowing hearts and the true north strong and free. However, the choice of the inukshuk logo problematized the connection between local identity and place. Though both the logo and mascots are based on native motifs, both were designed by non-native artists. However, it is worth noting that Vanok also commissioned Aboriginal artwork from Aboriginal artists. For example, the medals featured artwork from First Nations artist Corinne Hunt. Aboriginal aesthetics is common in the city of Vancouver, linking culture to the beautiful landscape of the province. By using Aboriginal imagery as a way to promote the Olympics, Olympic organisers and the province were able to show the close links between people, culture, and nature. For example, the topography of Vancouver was reflected in the graphic background, what Vanok called the look of the games on the top left. The undulations of the medals also referenced mountainous shores and ocean waves, while the shape of the podiums were reflective of Vancouver Island. Protests have also become a part of the Olympic Games and were visible preceding the 2010 Games. Further dissecting the divorce theory of the spectacle, David Harvey argues spectacular urban resistance occurs when there is opposition to the staging of specific events like the Olympic Games and is usually initiated in response to the mobilization of urban sports spectacle. However, Alok Malaja argues that resistance to the spectacle should be understood as an integrated component of the urban sports spectacle, not as a mere response. Many protests took place addressing various issues in various forms, such as marches and the stealing of the Olympic flag from City Hall. There were protests from the Cowichan Nation over the design and production of the Olympic Cowichan-style sweaters. The Cowichan Nation accused the Hudson's Bay Company of stealing their designs after rejecting proposals for the Cowichan Nation to produce the sweaters themselves. Here, authenticity over production was questioned. The Hudson's Bay Company argued that the sweaters were inspired by First Nations and did not breach any legalities, as the pattern complexity was not the same as the traditional Cowichan sweaters. To resolve and avoid further protest, a contract was negotiated between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Cowichan Nation, allowing the Cowichan Nation to become a licensed Olympic supplier. In the context of analysing nationalism and the World Cup on commercial drive, Paul Kingsbury states, contemporary analyses of sport usually fall into two camps. On the one hand are the global analyses that become the dystopic elements of nationalism, and on the other hand are the local studies that celebrate political resistance, end quote. The Games left many legacies, the most significant of them the Vanok-Forhurst First Nation partnership. The Vanok-Forhurst First Nation relationship emerged out of a complex political, social, and historical context. To launch a successful bid entailed significant political manoeuvring. Silva, Miletis, and Wadi, in their 2011 paper reflecting on Aboriginal involvement in the Games, suggest that for Vanok and its governmental affiliates, recognising the traditional territories and their contemporary First Nations inhabitants obscured complicated and uneven social relations. This served a dual purpose. First, it minimised political unrest and investment uncertainty, and second, it marked Vancouver and its Games as unique and memorable. They conclude, while the relationship produced some tangible and intangible opportunities for Aboriginal participants, the partnership was forged and defined by Vanok and representatives of the Forhurst First Nations. They state, rather than a model, the Vanok-Forhurst First Nation relationship should be understood as an outcome of unique complexities of history and not unrelated contemporary politics of economy and culture in BC. On July 2, 2003, Vancouver won the bid to host the 2010 Olympic and Paralympic Games. The hosting of the Olympic Games was received with much enthusiasm, but with also an equal amount of anxiety, especially from First Nations. Over a century, Aboriginal people have been participating in the Olympic Games as objects of cultural curiosity. Vanok wanted to be the first Olympic organising committee to change this and help Aboriginal people benefit from the Olympic enterprise, which was resonated from its five-pronged approach, giving Aboriginal people a legitimate and concrete stake in the Games. It appears that little was published about the legacies that were left by the Games a year later that were promised to Aboriginal communities. Journalist for the Globe and Mail, Robert Matas, reports that the Olympics were a sweet and sour dish for the First Nations, with some stating that the benefits exceeded their expectations, while others have not seen any evidence of an Olympic legacy. It can be concluded that although the Games brand themselves as being apolitical, they are anything but. They showcase nationalism and patriotism through national symbols and images, where identities and cultures become appropriated, commodified, and condensed, to negotiate discourses and narratives of identities which become mediated and to an extent obscured. The appropriation and the use of Aboriginal imagery, such as the Nukshuk logo, raised many questions around authenticity and the lack of representation of local First Nations iconographies, histories, and Olympic arrangements. For organisers and many spectators, it was a celebration of Aboriginal people and Olympic ideals, an image most desirable for Vancouver and British Columbia's place promoters. It was a spirit of inclusivity and the emphasis on legacy which inspired the London Olympic Bid Corporation and continues to inspire future Olympic bid corporations. And I'll leave you with this image.
Well, thank you very much to all four of our panelists. So we have about 25 minutes to discuss and have questions or conversations about, I'm just trying not to get cut on this cord, many of the themes that were brought up. So we can invite our panelists up to the table. I have this microphone that I can walk around with if anyone has any questions for us. Would anyone feel as though they are ready to start a discussion? Hello.
Thanks. I guess this is a question to both Priya and Selena, because I guess for me, your papers are in an interesting conversation with one another, but also with yours, Heather, in terms of the sort of the allies, the way in which an LGBT community should ally itself to other communities that may be actually more marginalized in terms of power and access to resources. But Priya, in your paper talking about the sort of appropriation of Aboriginal material culture through the Olympics, which is a really important story to tell, what's so interesting at the same time are the kind of resistance strategies that were happening even within quite a dominant, even within the dominant Olympic space, not within an official or even within a sort of a protest space of the Olympics. The way in which the Aboriginal Pavilion itself, although sanctioned and supported by VANOC and the IOC, was a really interesting space of resistance through even just the repetition of the phrase, "We're still here," which is an incredibly resistant and subversive message to be presenting in the heart of Vancouver in a space surrounded by buildings of the state, the post office, the CBC, and all the rest. So I'm just wondering if there's maybe a conversation to be had between those, and whether in your research, whether you've come up, Priya, with those other kinds of alternative resistant readings, and whether, I guess, in your research, Selena, what kinds of resistant readings there were to the Aboriginal Pavilion and the kinds of art practices that were happening there from other members of the Aboriginal communities.
I'm coming with the mic.
I guess I have to start with an Olympic confession, which is that I stayed out of downtown. I actually didn't go to the Aboriginal Pavilion. I didn't watch that Clements show live. I've only seen the film of it, partly because of the nature of how I live in this city and what the Olympics did to the city, that I actually stayed away. So I'm sorry, I can't really respond to what else is happening in the Aboriginal Pavilion. Although I do know a little bit from other than We're Still Here, and there's a film that's made that's available online that is a lot of images showing a continuation of history. That's the main thing that I know about the pavilion, but perhaps someone else who was in Vancouver at the time might have also be able to respond to that question. Sorry.
I also have a confession. I escaped the Olympics because I got Olympic fatigue from all the research. I did, however, go to a couple of the meetings organised by Olympic resistance networks, and they were very much quite private events. And you also had not just the marches, but there were the forms of protests as well. So you had a couple of people yelling things when there were photo opportunities and public events going on. So I think the main one was where this woman was yelling how the Four First Nations were apples. So they were red on the outside but white on the inside. And that was one of the key, I guess it was like a key interest to me, because it wasn't just the other communities that saw the Four Horsemen First Nations as sellouts, but there were also problems within the communities themselves that were part of the Four Horse First Nations. So some people saw the Four Horse First Nations as being sellouts in advancing interests that were implicit to their own needs.
Thank you.
And I have one other comment that responds a little bit to Heather's paper, which was so clear in the connections between the Olympics and colonialism, and a comment that responds also to Janice, a quote that Janice put up on her slide this morning, that without the four host First Nations signing on to the VANOC bid, the 2010 would not exist. And I read that this morning, and it hit me in another way when we're talking about the cultural activities and the ways that Aboriginal people engaged in them, and the responsibility that the four host First Nations holds, not just for the Aboriginal experience and legacy of the Games, but perhaps for the Games themselves, being in Vancouver, which is another thought. It's a thought I hadn't had before coming here today, so I thank you for that this morning, Janice, and also for Heather's paper.
I think in terms of what happens in these pavilions, they are usually nation-state pavilions. So having the four host nations pavilions does a lot of important political work, even though it's contradictory. And then the pride houses try to do another sort of work with having a pride pavilion. But again, it's like which story gets taken up as progressive. Russia House had a pavilion, and they also had a replica of a ship in the harbour. I don't know if anybody went there. It was like an 1860s sailing ship, representative of the port history of Sochi. So when the Circassian activists went to this ship replica that was built and sitting in the harbour, they were denied access because they were not Russian. They were protesters. And in fact, the replica of the ship, what they then changed their protest into, these are the ships that were used to deport us from Sochi to Istanbul. So there are layers of, what needs to be done, what happens inside these houses, pavilions, what happens inside the nation state. For me, I'm not that capable to comment on, and I think I'm more interested in who gets excluded and how we can imagine political life differently. Why do we want to have a pride house when we see, what it's buying into? As I said, it's buying into a logics that's very problematic of the nation state being the organizer, and anyway, yeah.
We have another question, comment over here.
I have just a two-part, a question for Kristen and then a comment for Priya. Priya, I just wanted to let you know I was doing research on the Olympics for my supervisor, and I found out the police were actually looking into a knitting circle that was making Cowichan sweaters on Vancouver Island. So I'd be happy to pass on the details of that. I thought that was really interesting. Kristen, what I'd like to ask you is, where are the artists going that are being displaced as a result of this gentrification? Are they leaving London? Are they finding new spaces?
I'd say that the interviews are from quite a while ago, but from what I understand, a lot of them have left London, in fact. Some of them, yeah. I think some of them have. Some of them have been able to stay. Because they've been in situations like they were able to get council housing at a time when it still was possible. These tend to be the people who are a little bit older. Mm-hmm. One thing I do. Yeah, the thing is there was this whole generational thing going on where people who were kind of above a certain age were more likely to own houses. or more likely to have council housing and that sort of thing. So they were in more kind of stable situations. But I do know that some of them have left the country, actually, at this point. Some people have moved to Berlin. One person's moved to Mexico, for example, at this point in time. I mean, I haven't really kept tabs on what's happened to all of them, but this is the ones I know. But I do know that some of them have left, and some have actually left the country.
Because it does seem like affluence plays a part in this upcoming generation for being able to be an artist.
I mean, but it's not just a housing issue. I mean, now, tuition fees have been increased to £9,000 a year, and that's going to have knock-on effects about who can study the arts and who's going to take the kind of risks of entering as an uncertain field as the arts, right?
Mm-hmm. And not being paid.
And not being paid, and possibly having to do things like unpaid internships and that sort of thing afterwards. So I think, that it seems like also kind of austerity measures have affected the UK along kind of generational lines in many ways. I mean, there's everything you hear in the news is about how, a lot of younger people, in particularly if you're young and you're an ethnic minority, it's particularly difficult. And so I do think, this is all a bit speculative. I do think as this will affect the arts, I think increasingly more. I also just saw another statistic that 1 in every 35 people living in London now, I think it was millionaires in US dollar terms at this point in time. And that sort of raises questions about what's going to happen to London. Is it going to become a kind of enclave for the kind of ultra-wealthy? But is it going to be making it very difficult for anybody else to live there? And what's going to happen, actually? I mean, in the U.S., I think from what I understand, in New York, a lot of people are now leaving.
Well, that's. I lived in Philadelphia and did some research in New York, and the artists are all going to Philadelphia because it's the only place they can afford.
Or even Detroit, of all places. Yeah.
So I have a few comments and then a question. And I think one of the elements that we're forgetting about what's going on with Aboriginal involvement in the Games is the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights. And so there was part of that momentum in the UN that enabled this to happen with the Olympic Games. And there were certain groups that were taking advantage of that. So Willie Littlechild in the 1980s was trying to get a World Indigenous team in the Olympic Games, and he was negotiating with President Samaranch at that point. Samaranch wanted a Nobel Peace Prize, and so he was in conversation with Littlechild about trying to get this team together, which would include Indigenous groups from throughout the world. And of course, they were having trouble trying to figure out who was Indigenous and who was not. And then there was the corruption charges at the IOC that came out in the 1990s, and the figure skating scandal that came out in 2002, which kind of took away from this Indigenous movement. And then, of course, Samaranch was no longer head of the IOC. But I think a lot of that helped to get this discussion about Indigenous people in the Olympic Games at the forefront of the movement. And but for me, I think, I'm really interested in the question that Heather poses, is how do we work around, at least this is the way I'm interpreting it, Heather, and I know we've talked about this a little bit before, how do we get around these politics so that we can each see the challenges that we all face collectively about how to mobilize our interests to make the world a better place through something like the Olympic Games, because let's face it, it's not going to go away, not in our lifetime. And so how do we work together to see something and imagine and do something different that gets us around these kind of individual identity politics? Because really it's about Indigenous people, different groups of Indigenous people working against different groups of Indigenous people, working against sexuality and gender and so on, which is divisive. And so then we end up with something like the Pride House at the Olympic Games. The Aboriginal Pavilion ended up in Squamish, I believe, which is just outside of UBC. Yeah, Musqueam, right. I mean, that was the only legacy that they got, right, was the place. And there was actually no programming to go along with it. So they got the place, and they didn't even get to have the organizers erect it. They had to put it up themselves. And a bunch of nice flower pots. They had to buy it, right. Nice. That's a good legacy. For me, I'm really interested in the question that Heather poses, and so, I mean, I would love to have a conversation around what we can do, and I'm just thinking about the individual roles that we play as artists. You have a strong voice in terms of trying to relay messages through the art that you do, and the little bit that I do with the media. How can I use the media to get these messages out, because you're right. When Sochi was on, out of all of the media that I did, maybe 70 interviews, not one asked about the Indigenous people who were there at that point, or the massacre. 50 interviews were about the anti-gay law. So I'm interested in how we can use the roles that we have in order to make this world a better place.
I sort of had a... Oh, thank you. Kirsten. Actually, first of all, to say that all those presentations were so interesting, so thank you. And very moving, actually, at times. Thank you very much. I just wanted to pass on to you, Kirsten, that I think that idea of creating work that involves housing associations in the cultural side of these mega events, I think that's such a great idea. And I would like to just pass on the name of an organization in London or the name of a group, I suppose, a protest group called the Space Hijackers. I don't know if you're aware of them. Yeah? Okay, great. Because I think they would be really keen to help make that happen.
There's also another group called Southwark Notes as well. Right. That, from what I understand, is also a kind of broad-based group, that it doesn't involve artists, involves housing activists and that sort of thing as well. I mean, so it seems like there are more of these sorts of groups, I think, because it is becoming such a huge issue. But thanks for the suggestion.
I just had a question. What really came through for me, starting with Selena's presentation, but I think it threads throughout your papers, as well as gestures back to something that David brought up, and Michael even from yesterday, is just working from Schneider, this idea of temporal drag, or whatever term you want to call it. I guess she's getting that from Elizabeth Freeman. But that there is something here about the collective memory of Olympics and cultural Olympiads that could be a resource, I think, right? I mean, that's part of the memory work we can do as cultural producers, as activists, in terms of not just archiving this material and keeping track of it, and maybe following up where evicted artists move to and all that sort of stuff, but potentially creating work out of that gets staged or shown at future events. So that idea that the archive, the tense of the archive is futurity, actually, it's not the past, is really productive for me. And you see somebody like Marie doing that actively and moving it forward and reiterating it in all of these media incarnation. That's really productive to me. And so this is kind of just thinking out loud, but I'm wondering if anybody wants to respond to that in terms of Rio, for example, and what kind of memory work that's local to that place, but also that maybe in terms of the image that you used of the IOC as this roving multinational corporation, right, that then takes over the place. Well, maybe as part of that takeover, cultural producers can bring that history of displacement and whatever with them and relocate it there for some of that transnational dialogue.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Janice, returning to Janice, but it's for me in art is a space of political imagination. That's how I engage with most art that I can access. And then at the other end, being an educator, it's educating for another world is possible. So it may be that these supranational, unregulated private empires, FIFA, IOC, the IMF, continue for a while, But it doesn't mean to say that we can't imagine that we can change them. So I don't know, of course, when, but I need to be able to imagine and teach against the fact that there will always be the Olympics. They're a relatively recent colonial modern machine. We have to be able to imagine against them, although it might not seem a very immediate project. So, and I really agree about kind of identity politics will always have its exclusions. It's limited. It does its own work. So I think partly the task may be to use the spaces inside and outside, the spaces in education, within the arts, and then all multiple scales of politics. For me, it's learning from the anti-globalization activists, like what else is possible? And if enough of us imagine it and can communicate that, neoliberalism will have to fail. You call it utopian politics, but that's where I go.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like I have to also keep that hope alive somehow. And one of the things that just came out, I was thinking of Robert this morning discussing his process with as part of the Cultural Olympiad and the IOC model of knowledge transfer between the host cities. And I thought, well, what if there was also a modeling of that knowledge transfer amongst the people who are resisting, maybe using social media, which isn't a controllable platform in the same kind of way, but just like thinking possibly of course, it wouldn't be funded, but it could be a way of thinking forward and backwards along the Olympic, the roving of the corporation. Maybe, and perhaps Games Monitor already does something like that. I actually don't know their work. Somebody might know more than that.
So just building on that, there was a Games Monitor meeting that I went to in which some First Nations activists from Vancouver that were part of the anti-Olympic movement here had actually been invited to London to share their activist practice and their experiences. And Kristen, maybe you can speak.
I think it's kind of. Actually, I just wanted to first say something about this idea of memory. I think it's also important to this whole question of who tells the story about the Olympics. Because I think that and maybe trying to bring have kind of other kinds of histories about what happened rather than kind of sort of sugar-coated official version that we're getting. I mean, it's because I think what we're going to hear from the politicians is always will be it was a success. I mean, what else could they say, right? But I think it is really important to sort of document what else happened, and also to create space for more critical voices and more critical accounts about what actually happened, I would say, and also open spaces for kind of critical debate about it. I mean, this is why I think some of the initiatives in London were important because they tried to open up that space for critical debate. So because otherwise, all the discussion was kind of flattened down into either really simplistic for or against, or kind of, you must, unequivocally like the Olympics, I would say. I mean, in terms of, I'm just trying to think. I think that this Games Monitor meeting I think was quite a while ago actually. So I don't entirely remember what happened, to be honest. But I think it's really tricky because on one hand there was my impression of the meetings, there was kind of sharing of tactics and that sort of thing. But I think as you're probably seeing, the political issues are very, very different. The issue around land claims, for example. I mean, that's a very different situation in the UK. I mean, and the kind of rhetoric around the indigenous operates in a very different way. So my impression is that the issues. The issues from I remember that meeting were about kind of poverty and housing and gentrification, because it was actually anti-poverty activists, I think, that were. They talked about what was happening in the downtown east side and what was happening to the. I think what they talked about was that the SROs were being somehow turned over so they could be. There was some kind of legal change they went to make it easy to turn them into luxury flats. I think that's what I remember, so that was the issue. But I think at the same time, I thought the local politics seemed quite different.
Yeah, I mean, I've only been kind of involved in some of the anti-Olympic activism in Vancouver, London, Sochi, Rio, and it is incredibly different. It's linguistically, it's historically different. So then, for me, I think where I'm at with that is, where else are there global social movements? Where else do they get together? At the World Social Forum and outside the World Social Forum. And they are grappling in those spaces with different histories, globalization, language, global south, global north, but they are and have been having conversations about wealth, climate, land, water. Sport is never there. It's not in the World Social Forum yet. And it needs to be. And then that returns us back to the affective pleasure of sport. It's too fun a thing. It's actually not that big a problem, right? The World Cup's not that terrible. And so for me, I think that's where the affective work is really important, because a student of mine, Satoko Itani, writes about that as it's an affective buffer. It's a buffer between making global sport, not recreational, not everybody should move, but these global mega events, the affective, easy pleasure of it is maybe a starting point to kind of say this is a really important problem that we're facing globally, and put it into that space perhaps might be.
What's been good about this conference so far, though, is I think people have been interrogating that kind of pleasure. I mean, and I mean, this is why the discussion this morning was really useful, I thought, because it was interrogating that kind of affective pleasure, and where is it coming from, and what is it, and what are the power dynamics involved? When this morning it was, and what are the relationships to gender, to ability, to race, et cetera, and not to think about affect as outside of power relations, but it's sort of implicated in them. But I think it is important to sort of interrogate it and pick it apart and ask what is it, I'd say.
So we are coming up to our end, so we'll just finish here with our one last comment question.
Well, just picking up on that, I think that is the challenge, and certainly that is the challenge that some of the anti-Olympics activists in different places have faced, is how can they mobilize pleasure and affect to their good. And I think, there's no shortage of critical studies around the Olympics in the academy. People like Dave Zwerin has been writing about sport. There's so many words that have been spilled, so much ink that's been spilled in academic journals around criticizing the Olympics, but it doesn't necessarily make the difference. And one of the things that was interesting listening to Neville and the way in which you were working with the Metro newspapers, those are the kinds of spaces that perhaps we need to be much smarter about working with, because of the ways in which audiences respond. And I think also we need to acknowledge that as educators working within another form of globalized neoliberal production, as academics, we are working within institutions that are horrendously implicated within funding corporate structures around the Olympics. And I think we need to also be more reflective and critically honest about that too.
And the Surat as a space of interruption, maybe,
But just to name, there's an academic, industrial, military complex. The industry of Olympic publishing is very critical, highly funded, and it's a machine. It's part of that academic industrial complex. And increasingly, it's, sport and security studies. Qatar is funding new journals. Some of the critical sociologists are getting pulled in to do that. So we have to be able to keep naming how that's happening even within critical spaces in the global north.
It's fun. I think the University of East London, I'm not sure exactly how that, but there is the kind of claim to be the Olympic University and that sort of thing. And I think it'll be worth looking at how this works and what the effects are on the people working there. And How do the funding structures work? I mean, what are the implications for academic freedom and that sort of thing, I would say. And, you know, as funding for education is cut, really looking at, you know, the push to go towards other sources and piggyback on these mega events and that sort of thing.